Welcome, everyone, to the International Institute for Strategic Studies. Our speaker today is Dr. Dambisa Moyo. Dr. Moyo is an international economist and author. Born and raised in Lusaka in Zambia, she holds a DPhil in economics from Oxford University, where she studied at the most prestigious St. Anthony's College. She holds an MPA from Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government, and an MBA in finance, and indeed a chemistry degree as well from the American University of Washington, D.C. Her first book, Dead Aid, was a provocative and well-received argument that aid to Africa has not only failed to work, but has actually compounded Africa's problems. Kofi Annan was among the admirers. She followed that up with How the West Was Lost, in which she argued that Western economies have lost their ability to accumulate capital, skills, and technology, and so face a very grim future indeed. Once again, she triggered a furious debate. I suspect that her latest work will do more of the same. Dr. Moyo is speaking today on China's race for resources and the threat this poses to global stability. Dr. Moyo.
Thank you. Chair will stand. Thank you. Good afternoon, and thank you very much for taking the time to be here. I'd like to just spend a bit of time giving you a quick outline of what I'd like to do today, and I've been given roughly 25 minutes, but I've also asked for a glare if I start to run over. What I'd like to do is to set China's race for commodities in the context of where commodities are today in terms of demand and supply. So I'll give you a brief snapshot of what the demand pressures that are emanating around the world are, and then I'll spend a bit of time talking about where the supply constraints are and why there's a global imbalance and commodity headwinds approaching over the next several decades. And then I'd like to specifically talk a little bit about what China is doing specifically and how this differs from any approach that we've seen anywhere else around the world. And finally, I would like to spend a bit of time talking about sort of the more controversial aspects of China's race for resources, things like neocolonialism, issues around labor participation, prisoners, and labor use. But we'll come to that later. And then hopefully we'll have a bit of time for questions and answers. So let me start off by saying that in the aftermath of the financial crisis, so since 2009, commodity prices have risen by about 150%. And as we sit here today, there are approximately 25 wars that have their origins in commodities that are raging across the world. And although these two quite extreme things are occurring, we don't really spend much time as a global community focusing on these very, very important commodity headwinds. Specifically, just to illustrate where I think this dearth of attention is, although we have Copenhagen Consensus that focuses on environment, we have the G20 focusing on banking regulation, we have the World Trade Organization focusing on trade, there's not a single international body that sits around and deals with the issues around commodities. And yet, if you go back to high school and you think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, commodities are the bare basics of our existence: food, water, our sustenance, and of course, some of the more advanced country creature comforts rely very heavily on fossil fuels and minerals. But let me start off by talking to you about why I see significant demand pressures occurring over the next several decades. First of all is the issue of population growth. There are about 7 billion people on the planet right now. We expect by 2050 there'll be 9 billion. By 2100 there'll be 10 billion. And I think it's really important to set this issue in the context of history. We are now experiencing a rapid increase in population growth, one that has not been seen in prehistory or history. And most demographers will tell you that you will not see it again once the population of the world flattens out at around 10 billion in 2100. This is a very, very unique feature, and though people like Thomas Malthus or the Club of Rome in the 60s and 70s, and the people who've written on the limits of growth because of commodity constraints from MIT were talking about commodity constraints, they had not perceived or expected that we would see such a massive increase in the world's population and in such a dramatic way in such a short span of time. Today, 90% of the world lives in the emerging markets, and we expect that the most significant increase in world population will come from the emerging markets, precisely the places where we see the greater demand for resources. The second key aspect of demand is wealth. As many of you will be familiar, I'm sure, there's been an increase of economic growth, but also improving living standards across much of the emerging world. The estimates now are that we will have an additional 3 billion people entering the middle class by 2025. The majority of them, again, coming from the emerging world, demanding many of the things that we've gone to love and get used to living in the West, better quality food such as proteins, cars, plasma screen televisions, mobile phones, and so on. The third key aspect of demand is urbanization. We expect that by 2025, there'll be an additional 3 billion people, which will take us to 5 billion people living in urban areas. And if you think that the population of the world is going to be roughly around 8 billion at that time, we are talking about a large proportion of people living in cities. In fact, urbanization is a very deliberate policy across many emerging economies to encourage people to live in cities so that they're better able to deliver infrastructure and delivery of public goods such as healthcare and education to these populations. China already has over 100 cities that have 1 million people each. If you compare this to the United States, which only has 9, Europe, which has about 23, you can see that this large population focusing on urbanization has got very serious implications for the production of infrastructure, housing, and so on, with, again, massive draw on resources. So that's the demand picture: population growth, wealth increases, I should say, and urbanization. The problem is that that demand picture is not being matched by what's happening on the supply. And let me go through very quickly a snapshot of supply of arable land, water, energy, and minerals, just to balance this out. Let's start first with land. There are about 13 billion hectares of land around the world, which is approximately 16 times the size of the United States. However, only 10% of the world's land is actually arable. And aside from the fact that we have to share the planet with other species, which also rely on arable land, more than that, we are living on arable land ourselves. We actually are building cities, and as I mentioned, urbanization is a big part of the puzzle, and that urbanization is being built on arable land, which is again causing shrinking in terms of how much arable land is available. China, with 1.3 population, has got 10% arable land. Africa has the most untilled arable land left on the planet, and hence, you probably would have been very familiar with a lot of the race for resources, for largely in Africa being largely around accessing arable land. Turning to water, 70% of the world or the earth is water, 70%, but less than 1% is accessible fresh water. And I mean accessible fresh water that we can use not just for drinking, but also for sanitation. China is below the threshold for global average for water access, and she's actually embarked on very aggressive tactics to try and secure more water. One example of this is that she's been rerouting the Brahmaputra River in India, and this has caused a lot of skirmishes, but also there's significant clashes with places such as Vietnam and Cambodia, which also rely on rivers like the Yangtze and the Yellow River, and again are causing a lot of problems politically in these regions. If we turn to energy, we are today living off of energy discoveries that were made in the 1950s. So since the 1950s, we've seen a sharp decline in the number of oil discoveries around the world. Now, some of you in this room might say, well, actually, I just saw recently that there was a discovery here or there. And actually, in reality, a lot of those discoveries have been made a long time ago. It's just that it was impossible for us to access them. Let me quickly give you an example. Brazil, Tupi oil fields are offshore oil fields in Brazil. About 2 years ago, the Brazilian government put out a big announcement that they estimated that there were about 123 billion barrels of oil on this offshore site. They neglected to mention that it's under 2 miles of salt, and it's actually, even with the infrastructure and technologies that we have today, it's virtually impossible to access. In addition, the estimates, bare minimum estimates of how much it would cost to break through that two miles of salt is close to $500 billion. So significant costs, the prospect of actually accessing this energy. Just to put China into context here, China, of 85 million barrels of oil that we consume every day, China consumes about 10% of that. The United States consumes about 20%. If you believe in convergence theory, that China is trying to move her population to live more like the United States, you can already see that the picture becomes very precarious indeed very quickly. We expect that there will be significant pressure coming from energy. The Chinese are trying desperately to move the billion people who live beneath the poverty line in China to have better quality standards of living, and you can imagine that energy is going to be a big part of that. Very quickly, if you look at minerals, the story is also very grim. The most important mineral as far as China is concerned is copper, and we're seeing already corporations having to go to more volatile, more difficult terrains and more politically unstable places such as DRC Congo. The incident in Chile a couple of years ago with the copper miners is a classic example of some of the mining difficulties and pressures that governments are facing in terms of regulation, but also having to go much deeper to access copper in these very difficult places. In addition, we're seeing much more evidence of expropriation and government action, not just in places like Argentina, but also places like Australia, which this year, in March of this year, raised the tax to 30% on its iron and coal companies. So we've got a demand picture, demand significantly growing, supply scarce, finite, and depleting on the other side. The question is, what is China doing in this environment? And I'd just like to quickly go through the three key aspects of China's approach for her race, for a campaign for resources around the world. The first key aspect of China's campaign is what I call symbiosis, China befriending the axis of the unloved. So these are regions around the world that have traditionally been bereft of Western investment and have tended to actually be ignored as trading partners. It's not just Africa, but places like Brazil, Chile, Colombia, much of South America, and parts of Eastern Europe. Today, Brazil has China as its largest trading partner, largest provider of foreign direct investment, and a similar story is across the rest of South America, and of course, Africa, which receives a large, significant amount of inflows from China. Africa, with about 1 billion people population, has less than 2% of world trade, and as we know, trade is a big component for economic growth, so you can see why there is a significant push to do more trade, and China offers that opportunity, and I gave you an example, particularly around land deals. It's symbiotic. This relationship is symbiotic because the Chinese need resources, but at the same time, these countries, whether it's across Africa or Eastern Europe or in South America, are desperately in need of investment and trade. In many regions, such as the Middle East and Africa, over 60% of the population is under the age of 24. In places like Uganda, 50% of the population is under the age of 15. They need investment, they need trade, they certainly need job creation in order to avert what we've seen across much of the Arab Spring, which I believe is much more of a economic problem than a political problem or democratic problem as it's often described. The second key pillar of China's rush for resources is what I call zero cost of capital. And you'll hear this very often when you go to business meetings. People say, well, China, the problem with China is that she keeps overpaying for assets. And overpaying meaning that if you used a financial model like discounted cash flow, you might find that the value of an oil well is $100 million. China comes in and will pay $500 million for the assets. And a lot of people have thought and have commented on how China is perhaps ignorant or perhaps not very savvy in terms of calculating what the real value of the asset is. Well, what I'm arguing in the book is that it's us who are sort of bound or wed to these narrow strictures of finance who are missing the point. The Chinese absolutely know what the value is to most Western countries and Western companies. But what they're doing is that they have a much broader utility function. They have got to get these resources to their country. Otherwise, they face a very political, volatile situation at home. So in other words, the political imperative in China of having to deliver economic growth and continue to meaningfully put a dent in poverty means they have got to get access to these resources. And in that sense, that broader utility function means that they have a much more appetite to access, to pay up for these resources. Indeed, we are hearing, and I do talk about this extensively in my work, that countries such as South Korea are actually explicitly advising their companies not to bid alongside the Chinese. They view it as a waste of time and money. If you think the Chinese are interested in an asset, you should let them go for it, because it's actually very unlikely that these other countries will be able to beat them out in a bidding war. The fact that China has over $3.3 trillion in foreign exchange reserves helps a lot. Deep pockets that she's able to go around and buy up these assets. The last aspect of China's approach is that she's becoming a monopsonist. A monopsonist is basically a key buyer or a price-setting buyer of a different different product or asset. Let me give you a couple of quick examples of what that might look like. One of the perhaps obvious ones would be a government buying military arms. The government is the main buyer of military arms. There are other actors that buy military artillery as well, but by and large, it's governments who buy, they have the biggest contracts for military armaments, and in that sense, the government can, who faces a large number of suppliers, can pick and choose and often force pricing on the market. Another example, very quickly, you can think of a large supermarket that's operating in a place where there's lots of crops being grown. So maybe Iowa in the United States. You have a Walmart there, and Walmart faces thousands of farmers, but she's the only buyer of these products. So she's able to set the price for different commodities. Well, we're seeing a similar thing. China as the go-to buyer of commodities. Already, many traders think that for copper and for coal, China is a monopsonist, a price setter, and the implications of that are very much an interesting aspect of where the competitive nature of a capitalist system, how that plays out is described in greater detail in my work. So this is what China is doing, and I'd like to spend a couple of minutes just giving you a few examples to make it a bit more live. A few years ago, 2006, 2007, China bought a mountain in Peru, Mount Toromocho. They paid $3 billion for 2 billion tons of copper. They've entered into beef swaps with Brazil. So they invest money in Brazil, and in return, Brazil provides all her beef, or significant proportion of her beef, to China. They have engaged in laptops for pork with Canada just a few months ago. The Chinese provide laptops to Canada. In return, Canada provides, through sort of a system akin to barter, provides them with pork. In Russia and Kazakhstan, the Chinese have entered into 25-year swaps where they provide capital through investment, through loans, and also trade. And in return, they have access to 25 years of energy, and both oil but also uranium for nuclear energy through the Kazakhstanis. And again, these are long-term contracts that do have the elements of this sort of, if I may use the cliche, win-win or symbiotic aspects. In Africa, the distance from North Africa to South Africa, at Cecil Rhodes's Cape to Cairo, is about 3 times the distance of New York to California. It's about 9,000 miles. That distance is now fully tarred. You can drive it only on tarred road. It will take you about take you through 15 countries. It'll take you about 5 weeks to do it, fully tarred by the Chinese as we speak. Let me close off by just highlighting a few things that I found with regard to some of the more controversial issues. There's a lot of discussion around, this is actually a new neocolonialism campaign for China across the world, and I absolutely do not agree with that at all. The Chinese, in fact, are incredibly clear that their interests are purely economic, which would make sense given the political imperative that I mentioned earlier. They've got to supply resources to their home. Why would they have any interest in taking on a bigger problem by having to have military control or political control of other regions? It does not seem obvious to me. The evidence around neocolonialism just simply does not hold. It's very hard to imagine that a poor country, China is number 2, expected to be number 1 in terms of global GDP, world GDP by 2018, but on a per capita income basis, she's around number 100. So she's still very poor. It seems very, very difficult to me and in my research to spot any evidence of systematic efforts to try and colonize in the clear definition of colonialism. In fact, the evidence that I found in places like India, across Africa and South America points to actually almost a love for the Chinese. And one example of this is the Pew Survey. The Pew Research Institute is an American-based institute. In 2007, they went to 10 countries in Africa, and they actually asked the Africans, went to Senegal, Ghana, across the whole continent, and asked them, what do you think of the Chinese? Do you like them? Do you hate them? Do you think that they're doing good things, and do you prefer them to the Americans? And consistently by wide margins, 97%, 98%. And I'd urge you to have a look at the study, very interesting. They said, we love the Chinese, they're improving our livelihood, they're investing in our country, and by the way, we also think they're better than the Americans. So quite a different perception or perspective than the one that you might see in the newspapers. Prisoners, we hear a lot of people talking about prisoners being deployed across many emerging markets regions, Turkey, Africa, Sri Lanka. Again, no evidence of a systematic and wide-based approach to deploy prisoners. You would think, living in a time when we have mobile phones with cameras on them, we'd at least have one picture that this is actually the case. We've scoured lots and lots of documents, not been able to find any evidence of this. The Economist had a very interesting article claiming that part of the problem is that many Chinese workers, and this is quite a simplistic argument, but it seems quite interesting, many Chinese workers are deployed wearing uniform. The uniform happens to be striped, and so people have a look and they think, oh my gosh, they must be prisoners. But really the fundamental point, no evidence at all that they're prisoners being used. The Chinese have vehemently dispelled these statements, and I'm not going by what the Chinese have said. I'm actually looking at what the data say, and the evidence does not suggest that we've got prisoners running around the emerging markets doing this Chinese bidding. Labor ratios, there's lots of comment about too many Chinese workers per worker on the ground, particularly in Africa. And in my work, what I've done is I've put together a table of 15, I think it is, projects across Africa from official statistics. Official meaning some government statistics, but also some NGOs like Human Rights Watch, some journalists such as New York Times and Reuters. And what we find is actually that there's in no case are there more Chinese workers on a project than there are African workers. And in fact, in many cases, you find very high ratios, 6 to 1. In my own country of Zambia, 15 to 1 African workers. So again, lots of misconception, lots of misperceptions around what China is doing. I'm going to close by just saying that the sort of net takeaway of this is I do think we are headed for a time when we have many more wars and conflicts around resource scarcity. The United States National Intelligence Council this past February issued a report cautioning that there will be many more water wars in the decades to come, and water is now increasingly being used as a terrorist tool. I think that is pretty clear that it's not just the wars that many of them I list in my work, but it's not just wars of land use or energy. It's water wars are the ones that I think are particularly problematic in the years to come. The IMF and the EIA, the Energy Intelligence Administration, have actually come out and said that they think that oil prices will be about $200 a barrel by the end of the next decade. And so we will continue to see commodity price increases, I think, even though we're in this lull, if you will, more tactical short-term softening in commodity prices. But I think fundamentals with demand and supply imbalances still point to higher prices. The last thing I would say, what that surprised me, and I opened with this, is that there is no international body that does nothing else but focus on commodities. And if you think about the number of wars, the risk of commodity price hikes, concerns around living standards, it seems particularly surprising that there is no international body that does nothing else but focus on this issue of commodity headwinds and how, in a maybe more coordinated, cohesive approach, we can come up with solutions and policies that can actually do something about the risks of commodity prices and conflict. The Chinese have clearly adopted a much more multilateral approach, gone around, done numerous contracts with numerous different countries. They're using the Renminbi much more now for these deals, and that is actually giving, and in a very friendly way, which is giving them a much stronger leg up than the more unilateral way, which I would say Western countries have tended to adopt, particularly the United States, which tended to be much more unilateral, as in by themselves, but also tending to be much more dependent on military incursions. I will stop there, and I'm very happy to take questions. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you.
Dr. Moyo, thank you very much for laying out very clearly the drivers on the supply and demand side of the equation as forming a basis for increased conflict and the potential for that to spill over into the security realm. Rising demand driven by population growth, embourgeoisement, if I can call it that, and urbanization, and then a very fixed supply of some of the key commodities, land, water, energy, and minerals. And then moving on to China's strategy. I'm sure there are many questions. I can already see a couple of hands. Yes, please. Sorry, I could just say, please, could you, out of deference to the speaker, name and affiliation before you ask your question, please.
Dr. Sajid Ali Khan, I member here. Could I ask you just to expand a little bit on this business of using the renminbi and swapping? But some of it, do you not think, is partly the unintended consequences of the United States using the almighty dollar? Because energy like oil and so on has been priced in dollars. Mm-hmm. And we know that President Saddam Hussein had plenty of oil, wanted to change into a basket of currencies, and look what happened to him. And Colonel Gaddafi had plenty of oil too, and he wanted a basket of currencies, including gold, and look what happened to him. But China is much bigger, of course. And along with that, could you just put a little subscript about solar energy? Because it is being used in places like India, who have plenty of sun for road lighting and cooking and all that sort of thing. Thanks.
Thank you. Do you want to take a few, or should I just do one?
Let's take three and I'll do it that way. So, yes, please. It's gentleman down the middle row, is about 5 rows back, second in. Yeah. No.
David Braham, you laid down very clearly the pros and cons on both sides, and thank you very much. I just wanted to ask about technology, which I don't think you failed to mention, but you didn't mention. Over the next 100 years, surely technology is going to improve so much that the demand for things like energy and minerals is going to decrease. How is that factor going to balance out your argument? And the China's love for Rolls Royces and various other Western brands, surely with the increase of technology means that they're going to be more energy efficient over the next century and longer.
Thank you. And my colleague Mark Fitzpatrick at the front, and then we'll turn to Dr. Moyo, please.
Thank you, Mark Fitzpatrick, a senior fellow at the Institute here. Thank you very much, Dr. Moyo. Very interesting. You mentioned war in 2 different ways. This is the Institute for Strategic Studies, so I have to ask about that. Both of those ways surprised me. You mentioned 25 wars that were commodity-driven, and I was trying to think of if I could come up with half that number. I couldn't, but maybe you could give us some examples of those commodity-based wars. And then right at the end of the presentation, You made a reference to U.S. unilateral intervention, military-driven, I think, some words like that. And I was trying to think if any of these wars in any way had a United States involvement. I couldn't think of any U.S. Military interventions, say, in Africa, except from Libya. But of course, your sweep is more global. But it seemed like a bit of a cheap shot, frankly. And so maybe you could explain.
It's opposite. It did say. Okay, thank you very much. The first question was around the use of renminbi and whether or not this is going to be, I guess, a much more central part of the Chinese strategy and what the implications of that might be, if I understood the question correctly. Yes is the short answer. We know already that the Chinese are engaging in a number of swap contracts for trade, particularly across East Asia, Southern Asia, but also to the IMF. And it's particularly interesting to me because, as you probably know, last week the Chinese have offered $40 billion to Europe towards the bailout, towards this Euro crisis solution. Brazil, India, and China, 10 billion each. The United States, 0. Canada, 0. And I think that this is probably, I'm not a political scientist or a foreign affairs expert, but it seems to me that this is more a use of soft power. And I do think that they do have a longer-term plan. I think there are lots of evidence, lots of discussion around the renminbi becoming more of a reserve currency. I do think that we are a ways off from actually it fully taking on a hold because they have a lot of financial deepening that's yet to occur at home. But having said that, it helps them a lot that Western economies are continuing to suffer the economic consequences of the financial crisis. And of course, it helps them a lot as well that the United States borrows so extensively from them. China is the largest foreign lender to the United States today. At some point, you could imagine perhaps that relationship could change. And the question is who's the horse and who's the rider in such a context. But for now, I think across the emerging world, definitely use of renminbi as a tool for purchases and as a tool for swaps is definitely on the rise. The next question was on solar energy. And with regards to solar energy, Beijing has the largest number of solar panels in place. The Chinese, I think, are particularly interesting. If I've got my number, yes, I do remember my numbers. 2011, the U.S. is spending about $700 billion a year of a GDP of around 15 trillion a year on military expenses. China is spending about $173 billion, a fraction of that, and it is second, so in the rankings. However, in my research, I found that the Chinese are spending significant more amounts of money on innovation and technology projects, and this comes back to the next question. But there is significant investment in finding alternatives and using alternatives, such as solar panels, nuclear energy, desalination projects. In fact, they and Saudi Arabia at the forefront in terms of desalination. So quite significantly moving towards alternatives. And I think for them, they do recognize, and in fact, what Minister Zhu, who is the Minister of Environmental Affairs, is on record as saying that the biggest bottleneck for China's economic growth is commodity scarcity. And I think that really puts into the mind the frame of concern that they have, and that they are looking at a broader range of solutions rather than just relying on traditional sources of energy and water and so on. The next question is about technology. I've touched on this a little bit. There is a lot of discussion about technology. As I think I intimated, this story that I'm telling now is very much in the vein of Thomas Malthus, the Club of Rome, Limits of Growth, which literature came out of MIT. They, particularly Malthus, perhaps had not really anticipated the population would grow as much as it did, but also perhaps they would not have anticipated that we got a bit of a bailout from technological innovation. I've spent a considerable amount of time trying to get a better handle on what sort of technologies are out there. Of course, I can't know every single opportunity of technology, but it seems to me that we do have serious problems in terms of how close some of the really groundbreaking transformational technologies are in terms of really being able to transform the story. I think things like shale gas, for example, and fracking, these newer, more innovative approaches are actually, in a sense, overplayed and exaggerated. I think that the evidence shows that claims are very often readjusted, numbers are readjusted to show that they're significantly less, and also there's a huge pushback from environmentalists, environmental concerns around what that might look like. I do hope and pray for technological bailout. For me, one of the big concerns, and why, and to some extent, I think there's this schism between developed countries and developing countries, is what countries would invest in. So, for example, in Europe and the United States, you don't worry about water nearly as much as if you were sitting in India or in Africa, where water is already rationed. And in fact, we have wars going on that have their origins in water. But you switch on a tap here, you never think twice about it coming out clean and available. In contrast, energy is a big deal here. It is a big deal in the emerging markets, but I would say it's probably secondary, and you can probably look at politics to see what the big pressure points are. But I think it has been a bailout. I hope it will be more of a bailout in years to come, technology and innovation. With regards to war, unfortunately, I was cautioned multiple times not to bring my book in here, so I couldn't do that. But there are tables, civil war and cross-border wars. There's a full list in there of all the wars that I'm talking about. And in addition, there's a fantastic database that dates back 1,000 years. It's not my database, but I think I really enjoyed looking through it. 1,000 years of water wars, specific regions around the world. And you'll see, and I think Michael Clare has written on this as well, you see that much of the conflicts are repeating themselves in places like the Middle East, where the water issues are becoming much more acute. But there is where I will point you, if you don't mind. And then you asked me about the U.S. unilateralism. Well, shall we suggest that Iraq and Afghanistan are two obvious examples where I think it's pretty, I'm an economist, so I'm sure the policymakers, the politicians, and we know the politicians come up with a good excuse that's actually democratic concerns that have driven these countries into war, but I'm more of a skeptic. I think it is about securing resources, and I think that's what they've tended to do. So.
Okay. I have a few on the list. I've got the two gentlemen at the back on either end, that back row on this side, please. Those two first.
Hi, my name's Michael Climbs. I work for Jiji Press, the Japanese news agency. I always have many questions, maybe a few too many questions. But I'm always interested in when people give arguments that they perhaps maybe start at places which are historically useful for them, or maybe don't talk about things which may weaken their argument. And I just want to bring the argument outside of commodities. I mean, forgive me, I haven't read any of your books, and I don't know if in your new book you talk about Tibet or Taiwan, but it seemed to me that you didn't mention Tibet or Taiwan in your talk. And I'm just wondering what your position would be on what China are doing in Tibet, whether you'd criticize their model or the regime, or what they're doing is neocolonialism, imperialism. What would you call that? Your response to maybe Tibetan monks who in the past few years have burned themselves, or on that front. And I also think there may be a thing with India, because if I remember correctly, China invaded India in '64. I think there was a war for 3 months, and Nehru didn't do very well politically. And I think that there still may be some territorial dispute there. I'm not sure, but I'd have to check my facts on that. And there's actually, I think they claim a state, perhaps. And so there's been tensions there. So I'd like to get your response. Thank you.
And then, gentleman at the other end of that row, please.
Hi, Lee Solomon's Foreign and Commonwealth Office. You were speaking about your doubts that China's race for resources had any neocolonial attributes, and the reason you gave was that because it was economically driven. And I was just thinking of British imperial growth, a country hungry for resources, going out, on my understanding, very economically driven, and then military power and religious overtones then kind of backfilling to kind of justify and govern that space subsequently. And I wonder whether there isn't more of a parallel than you might have first expect. Sort of linked to that, my question is just generally, I'd love to know what you think the implications are in your continent of Africa for governance of the Chinese, for local, democratic governance of China's approach? You might think there are none, or positive or negative, but I'd like to hear your view. Thank you.
You've covered all options.
And the gentleman at the front here, please. That's, yeah, okay.
Thanks, Mohammed Waziri, BBC World Service. I just wanted to know, you mentioned in your talk, and rather the picture that I got is that the Chinese aspiration is purely economic, in a sense you put it. And I just wanted you to know about how do you think the Americans are taking this into account? The Americans, Leon Panetta, just recently said that by 2020, if I'm not mistaken by the date, 60% of the US global powers and forces would be around South Asia Pacific, and they're just bringing in India into the whole concept. Part of it could be Afghanistan and their withdrawal from Afghanistan by 2014. Just wanted to know, how do you think the Americans are taking it? Is it part of the new American strategy in Asia Pacific? Thanks.
Should I? Okay, so with regards to Tibet and Taiwan, I abhor all violence, if I may use a political sort of statement. I'm absolutely not a supporter of violence in any form. I already touched on India and some of the skirmishes that are already occurring between the Chinese and the Indians with regards to specifically the Brahmaputra River. So I have talked a little bit about that. My sort of honest answer is, in addition to what I've just said, is that this is not my area. I wouldn't be able to comment about Tibet or Taiwan in more grave detail because my lens is very narrow and my prism is very focused on the economic consequences of what's going on. And in terms of any sort of political or any other sort of dynamic that's occurring outside of the political sphere, outside of the economic sphere, it's very hard for me to comment. I just don't know the details. I know what as much as you do around this, but I would say that I have not discussed Tibet or Taiwan in the book because the race for resources, as I was looking for it, does not really fall into that purview. With regards to the issue of colonialism, neocolonialism, if history serves me well, it was actually the missionaries who were in Africa and across much of the rest of the world from Britain first. They laid the ground, and then you had some of the explorers, Henry Stanley and so on, and it was only later that you saw the arrival of the more political infrastructure, which set up civil service and set up governments in these different places. That is absolutely not what we're seeing in China, from China, in any of these places. I've been across 50 countries in the last several years around the world, and not one place have I seen any suggestion of a political imperialism or anything to do with missionaries for that matter, or any efforts. In fact, the Chinese are criticized for not caring enough about the political environments in which they are. So it's quite the contrary to this notion of them having a political colonial axe in the way that we've seen in the past. In fact, if anything, one of the cautionary aspects of this whole China approach is that it is very temporary. These are scarce, finite, and depleting resources. When I spend time with African policymakers, I'm always cautioning them about the fact that the moment the last scoop of copper is taken out of the ground, I do not believe the Chinese will have any qualms about packing up and leaving. I think it's pretty clear what they're there for, and I think, I think it would behoove many governments and policymakers, wherever they are, to understand that these are temporary inflows, and that they should not be treated as permanent, access to permanent capital in perpetuity. And so I really still do not believe that this neocolonialism approach is true. Governance of Africa, I don't believe, in fact, I was talking and looking at some of the Transparency International data, which every year they come up with the Corruption Perceptions Index. So they look at corruption in different places around the world. And if you look specifically at corruption, there have been significant improvements, actually, over the last several decades. Now, you could argue, and I'm not arguing that that the Chinese are actually bringing in great practices. What I am saying is that I could not find a systematic and deliberate approach in their efforts, in their campaign, to undermine the political system that they found in their host country. I strongly believe that ultimately, to the extent that there are any transgressions around environment or environment or labor laws, I think it's the responsibility of the government to do their job. And if anything, I would argue that the situation that many African countries find themselves in today is much better than the aid dependency system, which has very clearly severed the link between the domestic citizens and the government, and therefore has eroded accountability. In an environment where the Chinese are trying to get something out of Africa, out of South America, and so on, they are building these roads not for the hopes of colonizing or being imperialistic leaders. They're building the roads so they can take the resources out. And if that alone is a positive externality of their efforts, I think most Africans, and as I said, the Pew Survey is a good example of what I'm trying to illustrate. I think most Africans would consider, or many Africans would consider this to be a good effort. So ultimately, governance in Africa, it's about whether or not African governments can deliver on providing public goods, can deliver on providing a strong regulatory environment, and can deliver on providing a proper policy environment that can incentivize people to do a good thing and to do good things to grow the economy and reduce poverty. And I think we have a higher likelihood that that's occurring right now with stretched budgets in the West and much more presence of the Chinese than we did ever before, certainly not in the last several decades. And then the last question was about the U.S. Specifically, what's the U.S. response to all of this? Well, again, unfortunately, I was banned from bringing my book. I would have read a little clip for you. But for those of you who are interested, on page 155, I do cite some explicit comments, cautions from U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. She was in Zambia last year, June 2011, attending a conference, the Africa Growers, it's called AGOA, Africa Growers and Opportunities Act, which is a consolation prize because the United States will not open its markets to allow Africa to trade its produce. Her comments were incredibly inflammatory. She did accuse China, without naming China explicitly, but it was very obvious. She did accuse China of neocolonialism explicitly. She used the word neocolonialism. She's cautioned the audience that they need to be wary of neocolonialism, people who come in, pay off the leaders, take out resources, and then leave. I think that probably is the sort of mistake that I'm disappointed to say is coming out of the U.S. If you go to the U.S., the sentiment around the Chinese, it has been used in the midterms in 2010 in particular as a hook to win votes. I think there's very little engagement. I think wish there was much more engagement, not just with the U.S., but I think with multilateral institutions. Last week I was in Washington doing a presentation at the World Bank. There's just not enough engagement. I think actually Western countries, the U.S. in particular, would get a lot more mileage if they treated the Chinese a bit more as peers as opposed to trying to undermine them, because they obviously can see exactly what's happening. So whether it's trying to grow the U.S. presence in Southeast Asia, or whether it's if I can use the term loosely, kidnapping dissidents or people who object to the Chinese government's approach to rule in the form of Chen, the blind activist a few weeks ago. That sort of approach, I think, leaves a lot of distaste across the emerging markets. Everywhere that I've been, people, they don't like it. And because we're trying to solve economic problems and trying to reduce poverty, I think more and more policymakers around the world are looking to China, which has been incredibly successful in moving hundreds of millions of people out of poverty in a short span of time, which is something that no one else has been able to do.
I'm sorry, we're going to have a last round here, and a few of you will be disappointed at the end, but I'm going to take them in the order in which I saw them. First, Giri, please.
Thank you. Giri Rajendran, Research Associate for Defense and Economics here at the Institute. I had two sort of questions that I'd like to ask. The first is, if it's not neo-colonialist, would you describe Chinese activities as being neo-mercantilist? So, for example, would they be selling the minerals and oil that they're taking out of the ground on the open market? And if they are doing that, then they are increasing global supply just as they're increasing global demand and helping to ameliorate the problem that they're partly creating. The second thought I had, which I'd appreciate some detail, if possible, is relating to the zero cost of capital, which you mentioned earlier. Do we see China using its forex reserves to fund such purchases? I mean, what sort of is the evidence of that? Is it cheap loans? Is it anecdotal? How do we know this? And if you could provide some details and possibly any WTO implications for that, that would be greatly received. Thank you.
Okay, the next one's down the front here, please. Gentleman in the third row with the red tie, who is just about to stand to help you.
I'm Samin from Bangladesh. I'd like to raise a point about the water resources. You'd be aware that this is probably the next front for conflict, and Asia stands in the forefront of this conflict. Indian economist Chilani, Mr. Brahma Chilani, wrote about it. He's got a book on this pretty elaborately. China is also trying to harness major water resources, you know, on upstream of Brahmaputra. There's 2 points. One is, would you tell us a bit about the extent? It's said to be one of the largest dams and reservoirs producing energy, hydropower. Secondly, Indians don't like it, Bangladeshis don't like it. You know, a major impact on the environment. How this would impact on the China's relationship in Asia, particularly with India? Thank you.
Final question. Sorry, it's the gentleman just behind you, sir, in the cream suit.
Thank you. Michael McClay, Montrose Associates. I would go along with what you're saying about Chinese intent not being strategically neo-colonial, but the last but one speaker was onto something with the mercantilist line. And if you're a Western mining company looking at the Chinese competition, what you see is not the same respect as there has to be now for working conditions and environmental sustainability, which may seem a bit rich after 300 years of colonialism, but nevertheless we are where we are. So what scope do you see for Western companies who do now have cleaned up their act on governance and do have good ideas on sustainability, working conditions and such like? How far can they work with Chinese companies with a fabulous record on delivery, and then moving across from what they might do at an economic level, and I'm thinking commercially, not government to government, is the day far off when the Chinese will work with the West in a place like South Sudan and try and use the resource constraints and opportunities to create better governance at political level? Because it's with these questions that we tend to see the agendas are as different as they are. Thank you.
Okay, I might come back to, sir, if you don't mind, just to clarify exactly what you mean, but I think I've written down a few points. So the mercantilist idea. So my initial reaction when you were asking the question was, yes, absolutely. I think we know that the fundamental approach that the Chinese have taken has been mercantilist. But then when you caveated it or added on the part about them then selling commodities into the market, I don't think that's the case at all. I think, if anything, we see them becoming more and more protectionist. Rare earths is a good example. They have about 97% of the world's rare earths. A few months ago, they put on a massive export ban. Just yesterday, they've actually made it even more stringent. And I think, if anything, the Chinese are going to become much more closed, I think, in terms of they'll be buying resources, but I think stocking up much more aggressively. I think for copper right now, it's just a small data point, but the estimates of inventories are around about 1 million tons, which for the market is huge amount of inventory. But in relative basis, they consume about 22 million tons a year, so it's a drop in the ocean. But I think that the idea that they would be hoarding is definitely popped up. And the other thing that they've been doing, which I thought is quite interesting, is with regards to iron ore. China's got vast sums of iron ore at home, but they actually buy a lot of it from places like Australia and coal. And just in terms of adding a little bit of interest into that, the sort of Australia is actually the largest recipient of foreign direct investment from China, none of the other emerging markets. So I do think that it's evolutionary, and I will come back to this point with the last question, because I do think there's something more fundamental that we need to do in terms of our understanding about what China's doing. Zero cost of capital, how are they doing it? Loans, swaps, there's lots of data on this. There really is very specific data, how big things are, and I have references in my work. And it's also from official agencies. World Bank does it. The EIA has got a great study on specifically listing out all the as many transactions as they can. The Heritage Foundation, the Chinese tracker from the Heritage Foundation looks at transactions. In fact, transactions, failed and successful transactions since 2005, which is when we think China really in earnest began this going out strategy. So there's a lot of very specific data about loans and swaps and some of the trade transactions that are going on. Implications for the World Trade Organization, may I say facetiously, does it still exist? Since 2001, we haven't really seen much action. I think the relatively complete disregard, whether it's the Common Agriculture Policy in Europe, the farm subsidy programs in the United States, Argentina and Brazil, all these different axes that we've been hearing about for many decades. I don't think there's much movement there, and I really don't think that the Chinese are going to hold back because of the WTO restrictions. I think the United States, talking about rare earths, the United States and Europe have brought charges against China in the WTO. I hope I'll be alive to see how that plays out, but I don't expect much. I think this is part of the theme in the book, that I think the game is sort of beyond what the WTO can do. The next question was about Bangladesh and water. So you cite Dr. Chelani. I do too in my work, because it's interesting. This is a case of someone who talked a lot about use of prisoners, particularly in Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, and his story was picked up by lots of the Western press, quite reputable press, Guardian, the Globe and Mail in Canada, and Washington Times, and it subsequently turned out not to be true. So I'm not too sure about, and by the way, these newspapers did not retract. They simply pulled the story off when Dr. Chelani was queried. The problems around water are not just with India or with Bangladesh. Significant problems with water, Vietnam, Thailand, and Cambodia, because they also depend on many of the rivers in China. I do think that there have been statements, and again, I point you to some of my work, where both the political leadership in China, Wen Jiabao, Premier Wen Jiabao, and the President Hu Jintao have stood up with Manmohan Singh of India to announce that they were going to work together on Brahmaputra. And so there is political engagement. How effective that is on the ground is a completely different thing. I do think the Chinese are incredibly aggressive. To reroute a whole river is pretty aggressive. But as I said earlier, the bailout thing that I think they rely on quite a lot is new innovations, the things that, blowing up clouds to create rain. I mean, there really are many things in the cutting edge. And by the way, that technology specifically was a US technology back in the 60s, but they're using that technology much more aggressively, I think. So, and then the last question, which is what I said I needed a bit of help with understanding what your main point was, but it sounded like it was something to do with the political role of China given the US and Europe. Is that pretty accurate? Yeah, yeah.
But one could say, as an African, and a lot of your countrymen in Zambia said this, that they've been quite exploitative and colonialists in what they have paid, and in the lack of respect they've shown to the environment in many projects across Africa.
Yeah, so
I'm wondering, not wanting to be confrontational,
yeah.
what are the scope for the West to work with China?
Right, that was it. Yeah.
Rather better at all this.
Well, yes, sorry. I'm sorry to make you repeat your clarify. Thank you. First of all, I do urge you to, let me put it this way, there are issues with any relationship with a foreign director coming into a country. What I'm trying to explain here is that the experience of the comments you just made about Zambians complaining about the Chinese is, to my mind, pretty much no different from the complaints that you'd hear about many Western companies operating in Africa. Issues around corruption, issues, I mean, you only have to go to Congo, where there are lots of discussions, lots of concerns by local people about the role of many Canadian companies, many European companies in their activities there. So I'm just trying to emphasize here that this has got nothing to do with China per se. It's got to do with the local environment and the need for there to be improvements in the political infrastructure so that the governments are able to be held accountable, not by journalists outside, but the domestic population itself. There's definitely work to be done there. I would like to also say that, you know, to the extent that Western companies are, care about environmental concerns, I mean, this is something that's relatively recent, and it's also been much more a dictate of shareholders rather than policy that has driven that. Many companies have been operating in places that have weak or non-existent legal frameworks, and they've operated with, you know, in very aggressive ways to transfer pricing, taking advantage of the local environment, environmental concerns, and so on, and labor laws. I do think that there is a lot of scope for the U.S. and Europe to do more in these places. I mean, the fact that Brazil is right next door to the United States and China is the one that has the largest trading relationship, I think is quite emblematic of a situation where there's been a fundamental shift is required in the mentality of Westerners as to what is going on in the emerging markets. It's pretty clear these countries need economic growth, they need trade, they need investment. I think if the Western countries actually started to look at the opportunities in that lens, they would get much more ahead much faster. The problem is the discussion still tends to be laced with criticism. So I just gave you the example of Secretary Clinton. It's very typical of the conversations that happen. But also we see very few sort of mainstream companies from the West going into many of these emerging market regions, and that's because I would say that they tend to be painted as places that are for charity and pity and aid rather than investment destinations. My last point is, I do think that one of the biggest challenges that the world faces now is that the Chinese model of economics and politics is clearly different from the model of economics and politics that has been alive and well in Europe and the United States for over 300 years. Now, you might say, well, that's rather simplistic. We all know that. But I think we are of the mind that the Chinese are going to conform at some point, and we'll keep putting pressure for them to conform to Western values and Western systems of political economy and economics. And my reading of the situation is that we do not factor in enough the risk that actually many more countries around the world, given their problems of economics, given their poverty, incidences of poverty, are falling much more on the side of China in terms of the mentality, looking to China as a solution provider for issues of economics. And so it's a long-winded way of saying much of the world might actually end up conforming more to state capitalism and perhaps more illiberal democracies. As we know already, the democracies that exist now, the majority of the democracies around the world are illiberal democracies, but we kind of paste over that. And I think this is something that we don't really give enough thought to. What kind of world would exist if we do see much more state capitalism around the world? And that's where I think your question about how we can work with China, I think if we really want to see more Western values, you need to kind of befriend them instead of criticizing them. One of the things I hear constantly when I go to China from policymakers and business people is just how sick and tired they are of hearing Westerners critique them. They never say anything positive. They never say, wow, great job, you moved all these people out of poverty. Do you mind sitting down and having a proper conversation about it? Always in the headlines about human rights, democracy, dissidents are the ones who get the Nobel Prize. And it makes it very difficult for engagement. And whether it's Chen, as I mentioned a moment ago, those types of ploys to embarrass the Chinese are things that sort of make them, and more broadly the emerging markets, more strident in sort of getting tired of being lectured to. And in fact, if I may say, the last sentence is that I think many people across the emerging world find it quite hypocritical, because the Western countries then take money from the Chinese, and yet they're quite happy to be sort of incendiary. So the relationship, I think, is poised for lots of volatility between China and the West. But for now, I would say the sentiment that I gleaned across much of the emerging world is there's much more sympathy for what China has done and what China is doing in terms of delivery of economic growth and reducing poverty. And many countries, I think, are looking more towards that. And I think to the extent that Western countries appreciate that more and understand the strictures of law and economics and politics that we have grown up and we love so dearly do not apply, but they've been successful even with the absence of those things, I think means that we need to start to think about the sort of things that China could do. And I think there's really, at this point, not much that they won't do to keep the economy going.
Thank you.
Thanks very
Well,
much.
reluctantly, I must bring this event to a close. Sorry to those of you that didn't get the chance to ask your questions. Better luck next time. Could I ask you please to join me in thanking our speaker for her presentation and her very full answers.